Clint Eastwood built his legend on silence, control, and that cold, unbreakable stare. On screen, he was the man who never flinched, never panicked, and never lost control. But behind that image was someone living with fear, guilt, and moments that nearly ended everything before fame even arrived. Few people know that Eastwood survived events that should have erased him from history, long before Hollywood ever called his name. Near-death experiences, hidden trauma, and choices that followed him for decades quietly shaped the roles, the rage, and the haunted men he played. And once you see what really happened, his films stop looking like fiction and start feeling like confessions. Clint Eastwood's life never started with stability. From the very beginning, nothing stayed in one place for long. Born in San Francisco during the tail end of the Great Depression, his early years were shaped by constant movement and uncertainty. His father struggled to hold steady work, bouncing between jobs and cities, forcing the family to uproot again and again. That kind of childhood does something to a kid. No routines, no long-term friendships, no real sense of home. And while Eastwood later brushed these years off as no big deal, people close to him say the restlessness stuck. It planted a need for control over his surroundings, his work, and eventually, the people around him. By the time the family finally settled in an affluent California neighborhood, the instability had already done its damage. Clint wasn't the calm, disciplined figure people imagine. He was restless, detached, and already pushing back against authority in quiet ways. And school quickly became the place where that tension exploded. But this was only the beginning. Because when Clint finally did land somewhere permanent, things didn't settle down. They spiraled. School was supposed to bring structure into Clint Eastwood's life. Instead, it exposed just how little he cared for rules. His grades lagged so badly that he was held back, a quiet humiliation that only fueled his rebellious streak. While other students blended in, Clint stood out, and not in a good way. Things escalated fast. Obscene messages scrawled where everyone could see them. A flaming display on school grounds that crossed the line. The administration had seen enough, and Clint was kicked out. Just like that, another door slammed shut. For a moment, it looked like his story might end right there, long before Hollywood ever entered the picture. A transfer to another high school offered a second chance, but his mindset hadn't changed. Teachers noticed flashes of talent and tried steering him toward school plays, sensing something more beneath the surface. Clint wasn't interested. He chased freedom instead. Fast cars, girls, and solitary skills that let him stay independent. He took apart engines, learned aircraft maintenance, and spent endless hours at the piano, pushing himself until his fingers bled. Whether he officially graduated remains unclear. Records are fuzzy, and friends later suggested he may have simply walked away. What is clear is this: Clint Eastwood didn't leave school with a plan. He left with restlessness, raw ability, and no interest in being told who he was supposed to become. And that reckless freedom would soon carry him straight into danger he never saw coming. In 1951, Clint Eastwood's drifting life was suddenly interrupted. He was drafted into the military and assigned a role that seemed harmless enough: swimming instructor. It paid almost nothing, but it gave him one skill that would later mean the difference between life and death. On September 30th, Clint boarded a military flight in bad weather, hitching a ride back to base. Almost immediately, things started going wrong. Reports say the back door flew open midair. Systems began failing. Communication was lost. And then, the fuel ran out. With no runway in sight and nothing but fog below, the pilot was forced to bring the plane down in the open ocean. What happened next has been told in slightly different ways over the years, but the core details remain chilling. The plane hit the water. Rafts were deployed, and sharks were rumored to be nearby. As waves overturned his raft, Clint was thrown into the dark, freezing water. He swam for miles, some say 2, others claim closer to 4, fighting exhaustion, panic, and hallucinations caused by glowing bioluminescent water around him. At one point, he reportedly thought he was seeing things that weren't there. Somehow, he reached shore. Cold, disoriented, and barely standing, Clint stumbled into a radio station, still in shock. The pilot survived too. They had both escaped something that should have ended their lives. But surviving didn't bring relief. It left behind something heavier. Because once you cheat death like that, it never really lets you go. Escaping death didn't calm Clint Eastwood. It sharpened him. When Hollywood finally opened its doors, he didn't arrive relaxed or grateful. He arrived guarded. Fame came quickly, but peace never followed. Behind the scenes, Clint battled intense anxiety, the kind that hit without warning and left him struggling to breathe. To cope, he became obsessed with control. Control over his image. Control on set. Control over every detail of his work. Directors noticed it. Crew members felt it. And slowly, that mindset began bleeding into the roles he chose. The tough, silent men weren't just characters, they were armor. While the public saw confidence, Clint was fighting something else entirely. Fear of failure. Fear of chaos. And maybe fear that survival had come with a debt he'd never repay. His characters rarely smiled. They didn't explain themselves. They acted first and dealt with the consequences later. But the real irony was this. Just as he mastered the illusion of control on screen, reality was lining up another blow. One that would shake him far more than fame ever did. In 1975, Clint Eastwood was filming The Eiger Sanction, a thriller built around dangerous mountain climbs and real risk. Eastwood insisted on authenticity, pushing for practical stunts instead of shortcuts. It made the film intense, but it also made it deadly. During a climbing sequence, a sudden rockslide tore through the set. A massive boulder struck two climbers standing on a narrow ledge. One was badly injured. The other, stuntman David Knowles, didn't make it. What followed stunned everyone involved. The scene that played out in real life looked almost identical to footage the crew had staged just days earlier. Those who returned to the location later described the shock of seeing fantasy turn real. What they had pretended to film was now hanging in front of them, motionless and final. The loss hit the production instantly, and it hit Eastwood the hardest. Reports say he was devastated and overwhelmed by guilt, feeling responsible for pushing the film's realism too far. For a moment, it seemed like the project might collapse entirely. But the crew urged him to continue, believing finishing the film was the only way to honor the man who lost his life. Clint carried that weight with him. And from that point on, something shifted. His movies stopped glorifying danger and started confronting its cost. After that loss, Clint Eastwood's characters began to change. The invincible tough guy started fading, replaced by men weighed down by memory, regret, and consequence. Violence was no longer clean or heroic. It lingered, leaving damage behind. In films like Firefox and Tightrope, he played men haunted by what they'd seen and done. These weren't fearless figures anymore. They were tense, isolated, and unraveling from the inside out. Even when wearing a badge, his characters felt dangerous. Not because they were powerful, but because they were barely holding themselves together. This shift reached its peak with Unforgiven. Clint returned to the Western, but stripped it of glory. His character wasn't a legend riding into town. He was a broken former outlaw dragged back into a life he hated. Every act of violence carried guilt. Every choice came with a price. It felt less like a performance and more like a confession. By this point, Clint wasn't just telling stories about damaged men. He was interrogating them. And while audiences saw depth and maturity, off-screen his personal life was becoming just as complicated and far more exposed. While Clint Eastwood explored guilt and consequence on screen, his personal life was quietly unraveling behind the scenes. Publicly, he projected control and privacy. Privately, his relationships followed a pattern of secrecy, distance, and unfinished business. Over the years, multiple affairs surfaced, some lasting far longer than anyone realized. Reports claim several children were born during these relationships, with some kept out of the public eye for years. In certain cases, even Clint himself has said he didn't initially know he was a father. Other accounts suggest he simply wasn't ready to confront it at the time. These revelations led to conflicting stories from those closest to him. Some of his children have spoken about a strong bond, while others have hinted at feeling overlooked or kept at arm's length. One daughter, adopted shortly after birth, only discovered her biological father decades later through a private investigation. When she reached out, Clint welcomed her, but questions linger about whether he ever searched for her before that moment. Perhaps the most public fallout came from a long-term partner who later alleged manipulation and broken promises, claims that spiraled into years of legal battles. Eastwood denied wrongdoing, but the damage to his carefully guarded image was already done. The man who mastered silence on screen struggled with it off-screen. And as time passed, the weight of those choices became harder to ignore, especially as age finally began to catch up with him. As Clint Eastwood grew older, something unusual happened. He disappeared. For long stretches, he wasn't seen in public at all. No interviews. No red carpets. No familiar appearances at events he'd attended for decades. Before long, rumors started circulating online, with fans quietly wondering if something was seriously wrong. Reports claimed concerns about his health, fueled by his absence from public gatherings and even events tied to his own family. Speculation filled the silence, but no clear answers came. And true to form, Clint said nothing. He let the noise pass without responding. Then, just as quietly as he vanished, he returned. A rare public appearance showed him alert, smiling, and very much present. Shortly after, he was spotted back on a film set, directing with the same focus he'd always had. The message was subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't done yet. Behind the scenes, Clint maintained a disciplined lifestyle, reportedly sticking to a low-fat, high-protein diet and avoiding excess. Friends have suggested this wasn't about vanity, but fear. Fear of repeating his father's early death and losing control to age the same way he once feared chaos in his youth. And that brings the story full circle. Because Clint Eastwood never stopped fighting time, fear, or himself. The only question left is whether surviving everything he did made him stronger, or simply more guarded. Clint Eastwood was never just the fearless icon he played on screen. He was a survivor shaped by instability, haunted by close calls with death, and driven by a need to stay in control of a world that once felt completely unpredictable. The silence, the grit, the haunted stares, they weren't acting choices. They were learned defenses. Every phase of his career mirrors a chapter of his life. The reckless youth, the near-fatal escape, the obsession with control, the guilt that followed tragedy, and finally, the aging man confronting time, legacy, and the weight of everything left unsaid. His films didn't just entertain, they quietly revealed who he was becoming. In the end, Clint Eastwood's toughness wasn't about strength or dominance. It was about survival, about carrying fear without letting it show. And maybe that's why his story still resonates. Because behind the legend isn't a myth. It's a man who lived long enough to face everything he once ran from. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because stories like this prove that the most powerful battles are the ones no one ever sees.